Welcome back. If you want me to keep telling these stories, stick around for more. If you want to, leave a comment telling me from what country you are listening from. From the very first day, I could sense it. There was something about that house. No, not the house itself, but the land it sat on. The thick forest behind it loomed like a wall, tall and dark, casting long shadows even during the brightest parts of the day. It wasn't the kind of place you felt at home in, not really. But I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just new home jitters. The dogs, however, were a different story. Usually, they were fearless, bounding through parks, chasing anything that moved, tails wagging with endless excitement. But here, they changed. I remember watching them as we unpacked that first day, their playful energy suddenly draining the closer they got to the tree line. They stopped cold, their ears up, bodies stiff. They wouldn't go near the edge of the yard, not even for their favorite toys. Instead, they just stared, unblinking, into the trees. It was as if something was staring back, something I couldn't see. At first, I laughed it off. Just dogs being weird, I told myself. But that night, everything shifted. The air grew colder, sharper, even though it was a warm season. I could feel it, this odd tension, like the atmosphere itself had changed. I lay in bed trying to relax, but then the sound started. Soft at first, like leaves rustling. Then it became clearer. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, right at the edge of the forest. I froze, every muscle tight. It was just loud enough to notice, but not enough to pinpoint. My mind raced with rational explanations. Animals, wind, anything. But deep down, I knew. This was different. I didn't sleep well that night. I woke up multiple times, each time with that creeping feeling that I wasn't alone. And then there were the shadows. The next few nights, I'd find myself drawn to the windows, peering out into the darkened woods. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks, adjusting to the night. But no, there were definitely figures. Dark, shifting figures. They moved quickly, almost out of sight before I could focus, but I swear I saw them. Too tall to be animals, too fast to be people. The dogs became more agitated, barking at nothing, or so I thought. Every evening, like clockwork, they would gather at the back door, staring into the same patch of trees. Their barks were frantic, sharp, as if they were warning me of something. I tried everything to calm them down, but nothing worked. They'd fixate on one spot, growling low in their throats, as if they could see something lurking there, just out of reach. Each day, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. It wasn't just the dogs or the shadows or the footsteps. It was the oppressive sense that something was watching, waiting. It was in the air, in the silence that filled the house at night. The woods weren't just trees and shadows anymore. They felt alive, like they were hiding something dark, something that didn't want us there. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was getting closer. It wasn't long before the strange footsteps and shadows turned into something far more disturbing. One night, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock on the back door. I sat up, my heart racing. The dogs went wild, barking furiously, but when I looked out the window, there was no one there. Just the same thick darkness, the trees swaying slightly in the night breeze. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch hitting the door. But the sound had been too rhythmic, too purposeful. The knocking started happening more frequently after that. Sometimes on the back door, sometimes on the windows. Always at night. Always when the house was at its quietest, as if it was waiting for us to be at our most vulnerable. My family heard it too, but whenever we'd rush to the door or a window, there was nothing there. No footprints in the dirt, no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the sound. It was as if the forest itself was playing with us. Then came the voices. At first, they were subtle, barely audible over the sound of the wind. I'd be sitting in the living room, and I'd hear my name being called from outside. It sounded like my mom, but when I asked her, she swore she hadn't called me. The first few times it happened, I brushed it off. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe I was just imagining things, but then it got worse. The voices became clearer, more insistent. They didn't just call my name anymore. They sounded like full conversations, but the words were just out of reach, too muffled to make out. One night, while sitting in the living room, I heard my dad's voice coming from the backyard. He was supposed to be at work, but the voice was unmistakable. "Come outside," it said, calm but firm, as if trying to coax me out into the darkness. My stomach turned. I knew it couldn't be him, yet the voice was so clear, so familiar. The dogs started growling, their hackles raised, pacing back and forth in front of the door. I didn't move, I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to stay away from whatever was mimicking my father's voice. That was the night we decided to install security cameras. My family and I were desperate for answers, anything that could explain what was happening. We put up a fence around the backyard, trying to create some kind of barrier between us and whatever was out there. But it didn't help. The knocks continued, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always there. And the voices got bolder. Sometimes they sounded like my mom, other times like my sister. They would call from the edge of the forest, just loud enough for me to hear, always when I was alone. The cameras, though, showed nothing. No one was ever caught on film. No animals, no people, nothing. It was as if the sounds, the knocking, the voices were coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It didn't make sense. Even when the back door rattled, as if someone was trying to get in, the cameras showed absolutely nothing. And yet, every night, it felt like something was getting closer, bolder, like whatever was out there wanted in. The knocking and voices had become part of the nightly routine by this point, but what happened on that last night was something I'll never forget. It started out like every other evening, quiet with the same creeping feeling of being watched. The house felt heavy, as if the air itself was charged with something dark and oppressive. The dogs were on edge, pacing back and forth near the back door, their eyes darting nervously towards the forest. By then, they had stopped barking as much, almost like they were resigned to whatever was out there, as if they had learned that barking wouldn't make it stop. We had all gathered in the living room, trying to distract ourselves when we heard it, a sharp knock, louder than usual, right on the back door. The kind of knock that demanded attention. I jumped, my pulse quickening. This time, it didn't feel like the usual eerie taps. It felt like someone or something was demanding to be let in. My dad stood up to check the cameras, but just as he did, we heard it again. Not just a knock this time. Something was trying the doorknob. The metal rattled as if someone was twisting it, testing it, trying to get in. We all froze. The dogs started growling again, low and deep, but didn't approach the door. That was when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, the back door handle slowly turning. I'm not talking about a quick, nervous jiggle. It was deliberate, steady, like whoever was out there was in no rush, confident that they would eventually get in. My dad rushed to the door and yanked it open. Nothing. There was no one there. Just the cool night air rushing in and the darkness of the forest beyond. But something felt off, like the house itself was holding its breath. We checked the security footage immediately. My dad, who had always been the rational one, seemed more unnerved than I'd ever seen him. As we replayed the footage, my skin crawled. The camera showed the back door perfectly still, untouched by human hands. Yet, in real time, we had all seen the handle turn. It was unmistakable. The door had moved by itself. There was no wind that night, no tricks of the light. It had moved, as if whatever had been outside had slipped through without ever needing to show itself. The camera captured something else, though. Right before the handle turned, a faint shadow passed across the yard, fast, almost too quick to see. But it wasn't the kind of shadow cast by a tree or an animal. It moved unnaturally, low and fluid, disappearing before it reached the door. We watched it over and over again, our stomachs tightening with each replay. It wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. Whatever it was something we couldn't explain, something that defied logic. That was the last straw for us. My dad didn't say anything as he turned off the footage, but we all knew. We had stayed too long. Something in that forest, or in the house itself, didn't want us there. We packed up that night, hurriedly throwing clothes and essentials into bags without saying a word. The dogs, who had been so on edge for weeks, suddenly seemed calmer as we got ready to leave, like they knew we were finally doing the right thing. The moment we drove away, I felt the tension ease. It was as if the air around the house had been holding us in, suffocating us, and now, as we left, it was letting go. But even now, sometimes late at night, I still think I hear the faint sound of knocking, as if whatever was in that house followed us, waiting patiently for its chance to be heard again. It started out as an ordinary night shift, the kind where time seems to crawl, and the only sound you hear is the faint hum of the refrigeration units echoing through the store. The dairy cooler was its usual freezing temperature, the kind of cold that clings to your skin and makes your breath feel thick. The store had been closed for hours, locked down tight. It was just me and my coworker, moving slowly through the routine, stocking shelves under the harsh, buzzing lights. The world outside felt distant, sealed off, leaving us alone in the eerie quiet of the empty store. I was in the middle of stacking milk cartons when I noticed it, just a small flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. It was the kind of thing that normally wouldn't catch my attention, just the shadow of my coworker or a reflection off the glass. But this was different. My eyes snapped up, instinctively drawn to the large window that overlooked the main aisle, and that's when I saw it. Someone, or something, was walking past. The figure moved slowly, almost casually, down the main aisle, their pace calm, deliberate. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that it was a reflection, maybe, or a lingering customer we'd somehow missed during closing. But the store had been locked for hours, and it was just the two of us. My mind raced for a reasonable explanation. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that gut-wrenching sense of unease settled deep inside me. I stared through the cooler's window, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't stop or glance around. It just kept walking, a steady, quiet stride that didn't fit the stillness of the store. The way they moved was what unsettled me the most. Too smooth, too assured, like they knew exactly where they were going. There was no urgency, no hesitation, but also no sound. Not a single footstep, not the creak of a floorboard, just a silent, almost ghostly presence. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The cooler's temperature suddenly felt more biting, as if the air had grown colder just from that moment. For a second, I questioned everything. Could someone have gotten in? But all the entrances were locked. Could it have been a trick of the light? But what I saw was unmistakable. A full figure, a person walking just a few feet away from me, on the other side of the glass. The figure vanished from view as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me standing there, frozen in place, heart pounding in my chest. The store was empty, or at least it was supposed to be. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, like the silence around me had taken on a life of its own. I stood there for what felt like forever, my mind spinning, trying to process what I had just seen. My heart was racing, and every hair on my arms stood on end. I glanced over at my coworker, who was just a few feet away, casually stocking shelves as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Trying to shake the unsettling feeling gnawing at me, I cleared my throat and asked, "Did you see that?" My voice was tight, betraying the unease creeping up my spine. He didn't even look up from his task. With the same calm demeanor, he shrugged and said, "Yeah, someone just walked by the cooler." His tone was so nonchalant, almost bored, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. I stared at him, expecting him to show some kind of reaction, surprise, confusion, anything. But he just kept working, like he hadn't just seen what I saw. His lack of concern sent a wave of unease crashing over me, making the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I couldn't understand it. How could he be so calm? We were alone in the store. The doors were locked. There was no one else here. There couldn't be. And yet, he seemed completely unfazed, as though random figures strolling through the locked-up store were just part of the night shift. I tried to laugh it off, to calm my racing thoughts, but every time I replayed the moment in my head, I felt that deep, unsettling pit grow heavier in my stomach. "What do you mean, someone?" I pressed, hoping he would give me some kind of reasonable explanation. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe there was a simple answer that I just hadn't thought of. But all he did was glance up briefly, looking at me with an expression that seemed far too relaxed for what we had both just witnessed. "Yeah, I saw them walk by. They were there 1 minute and gone the next," he said with a shrug, like this sort of thing happened all the time. His indifference was almost more disturbing than the figure itself. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but he acted like it was nothing, like it was perfectly normal for someone to be walking through the store when it was supposed to be locked down for the night. I couldn't understand it. The sheer lack of emotion, the way he didn't even question it, it made me question my own senses. Was I overreacting? Was this something I was supposed to just accept, like he had? But deep down, I knew what I saw wasn't normal, wasn't something that could be brushed off so easily. My coworker's calm attitude did nothing to settle the growing unease inside me. If anything, it made things worse. His casual dismissal of something so clearly wrong felt like a warning in itself, like he knew something I didn't want to know. I felt trapped between the cold logic of the situation and the creeping sense of dread that had already settled deep in my bones. My coworker's indifference wasn't enough for me. There was no way I could just shrug it off like he had. My pulse was still racing, and my instincts screamed that something was wrong, terribly wrong. Without saying another word, I left the cooler and hurried out into the main aisle where I had seen the figure walk by. The store was bathed in dim, eerie lighting, and the silence was suffocating. I could hear the sound of my own footsteps echoing as I walked down the empty aisles, my heart thudding in my chest with every step. I reached the spot where I'd seen the figure and stopped, scanning the area. It felt even stranger out here. The usual background noise of the store, the hum of the freezers, the occasional creak of the building settling, seemed distant, as if I'd stepped into a different space altogether. My breath felt heavy, and there was this gnawing sense of being watched, even though I could see no one. I stood there, rooted in place, the back of my neck prickling, convinced that any second now I'd see something or someone lurking just around the corner. But there was nothing. No sign of movement, no shadow, no sound. The store was completely still. It was like the figure had simply vanished into thin air. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. I walked the perimeter of the store, checking every aisle, every corner, hoping to catch even a glimpse of whatever, or whoever, it was that had walked by the cooler. But each step only led to more emptiness. The store was dead quiet, the kind of silence that's almost oppressive, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond my reach, lurking in the shadows where I couldn't see it. When I reached the front doors, they were still locked, just as we had left them. My car was the only one in the parking lot, the empty expanse of asphalt stretching out under the dim streetlights. I pressed my face against the glass, scanning the lot one more time, half expecting to see something, anything, moving out there in the darkness. But there was nothing. No sign of life, no footsteps, no figure, just stillness. The weight of the situation pressed down on me. I couldn't find a single trace of anyone else being in the store. And yet, I knew what I'd seen. I retraced my steps again, slower this time, hoping maybe I had missed something. I checked the break room, the stock room, even the employee bathrooms. There was no one. It was like I had imagined the whole thing, but I knew that wasn't true. My skin still prickled with that undeniable sense of wrongness. When I finally circled back to the dairy cooler, my coworker was still there, stacking milk cartons like nothing had happened. His calmness made me feel even more unsettled, as if he were living in a completely different reality from the one I had just experienced. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the dread that clung to me, but it wouldn't go away. It was like the air in the store had changed, heavier, more oppressive. Something was off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there, whatever I had seen, hadn't truly gone. I looked at my coworker one last time, waiting for him to acknowledge what had happened, but he never did. He just kept working, as if this was the most normal night in the world. I wanted to ask him how he could be so calm, how he wasn't feeling the same cold, creeping fear that had settled deep in my chest. But I didn't. I couldn't. Somehow, his indifference made the whole thing worse, like he knew something I didn't, or worse, like he had accepted it. We finished the shift in an eerie silence, the faint sounds of the coolers and the store settling only making the quiet more unbearable. Even as I walked to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, watching me from the darkness. But I never did. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove away, the empty parking lot disappearing in my rearview mirror. But the unsettling feeling didn't leave. Even now, I think back to that night, and I still don't have an explanation for what happened. All I know is that whatever I saw, it wasn't supposed to be there. And I'll never forget the way it felt, like the store itself had been holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was an ordinary day in 2013, and I was working my usual rounds as an insurance claims inspector. My routine was straightforward. I'd call the client about 30 minutes before arriving for a site inspection, just to give them a heads up. That day, I dialed the home phone number listed on the account, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. The phone rang a few times before an elderly woman's voice answered. Her tone immediately caught my attention, frail, almost strained, as if speaking took a great deal of effort. But what unnerved me more was the static-filled connection that made her words crackle through the line. "Hello? Can you hear me? Hello?" The woman repeated, her voice distorted by the poor connection. The way she spoke was almost frantic, as though she was desperately trying to be heard. I leaned into the phone, trying to make sense of what she was saying, but the static only worsened. Each time she repeated her words, the distortion grew stronger, more unsettling. Something about the way her voice wavered sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. I spoke up, trying to respond, but my voice seemed to get lost in the noise, swallowed by the crackling interference on the line. Before I could even ask her anything, the line went dead. Silence. The abruptness of it left me staring at my phone, my heart racing in a way that felt disproportionate to what had just happened. I told myself it was just a bad connection, nothing more. But there was something in the way her voice had sounded, something off that I couldn't quite shake. Thinking it was just a phone glitch, I dialed the number again, fully expecting her to pick up. This time, the phone rang and rang, but no one answered. The unsettling feeling in my gut started to grow. Why hadn't she picked up again? Where had she gone? Trying to push the strange encounter to the back of my mind, I decided to call the cell phone number listed on the file instead. The connection was clear this time, and a young woman's voice answered. She was polite, explaining that she was out but would be back at the house within 30 minutes. Her voice was steady, normal, nothing like the frantic elderly voice I had heard just minutes before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to me, lingering from that first call. It felt like a strange shadow looming over what should have been a routine workday. Little did I know, that unsettling moment was only the beginning of something far more disturbing. After the unsettling call with the elderly woman, I shook off the creeping sense of unease and refocused on the task at hand. With no answer on the home phone, I decided to call the cell number on file, hoping for a more straightforward interaction. This time, the connection was crisp, the static gone, and a much younger woman answered. Her voice was clear and calm, nothing like the strained, frantic tone of the older woman I had spoken with moments earlier. She explained that she was out running errands but would be back at the house in about 30 minutes. I let her know that was fine, and after hanging up, I felt a small wave of relief. Maybe that first call was just some strange glitch, a random interference on the line. When I pulled up to the house, it looked perfectly ordinary. It was a modest, suburban home with a well-maintained lawn, the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary should happen. Yet, as I stepped out of my car, that nagging feeling from earlier returned. The house felt quiet, too quiet, almost like it was holding its breath. The air felt heavier than it should, and as I approached the front door, I found myself instinctively glancing around, as if expecting to see something, or someone, watching from the windows. I rang the doorbell, the chime echoing softly through the house. For a moment, I stood there, waiting, fully expecting the elderly woman to answer. I pictured her slowly making her way to the door, her frail voice echoing in my mind. But after a few moments of silence, no one came. I pressed the doorbell again, the sound cutting through the quiet, but still nothing. The house remained eerily still, almost like it was abandoned. I knocked, this time louder, thinking maybe the old woman hadn't heard the bell. As the silence stretched on, my thoughts raced. Had she stepped out? Was she okay? I couldn't shake the memory of her voice on the phone, so fragile and filled with urgency, as if she had been struggling to communicate with me. but there was no answer. The house remained as still as ever, and with each passing second, the unsettling tension built inside me. Just as I was about to knock again, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the silence. I turned to see the young woman from the phone pulling up, looking as calm and collected as she had sounded. She got out of her car and apologized for running late. Her presence momentarily eased the tension I felt, and I decided to bring up the earlier phone call. "I think I might have woken up your mother when I called earlier," I said, trying to be polite. The words hung in the air for a moment before I noticed a shift in her expression. Her face twisted into confusion, and her eyes widened ever so slightly as she processed what I had said. "My mother?" she repeated, her voice soft, tinged with hesitation. I could see something flicker behind her eyes. Fear, maybe? "There's no one else living here," she added quietly, almost as if the words were difficult for her to say. The sense of unease I had been trying to ignore all day suddenly flooded back, stronger than before. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach as her words sank in. My mind reeled. No one else lived in the house? Then who had answered the phone? The voice on the other end had been so clear, old, weak, but unmistakably real. The young woman glanced nervously toward the house, her unease now mirroring my own. Her sudden shift in demeanor told me this wasn't the first time something strange had happened here. The silence between us grew heavier, as if the house itself was listening. I didn't want to press her, but the look on her face made it clear that there was more to the story, something she wasn't ready to admit just yet. We both stood there for a moment, caught in the unsettling realization that something wasn't right about this house. Whatever it was more than just a bad phone connection or a simple misunderstanding. The weight of it lingered, a shadow hanging over the conversation, waiting to reveal itself. As we stood there, the young woman's confusion quickly turned to something darker, fear. I could see it creeping across her face, her eyes flickering with the same unsettling realization that had been gnawing at me since that first phone call. "What do you mean, my mother?" she repeated, but this time her voice was shaky, almost hollow. She took a step closer to the house, her gaze darting toward the front door, as though expecting something, or someone, to suddenly appear. I felt my own stomach tighten. I could still hear the echo of the elderly woman's voice in my mind, her frail, static-filled plea. "Hello? Can you hear me?" It was impossible to reconcile the voice I'd heard with the young woman standing before me now. If no one else lived in the house, then who had answered the phone? A cold, prickling sensation spread across my skin, as though the air itself had turned against us. I didn't want to alarm her, but I couldn't ignore what had happened. "When I called earlier, an older woman picked up," I said slowly, gauging her reaction. "She said hello a few times, like she couldn't hear me, and then the call disconnected." The young woman's face went pale. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she turned and hurried toward the front door, pulling her keys from her pocket with trembling hands. I followed, unsure of what we would find inside, but knowing I couldn't just leave now. Whatever was happening here was more than just a misunderstanding. As soon as we stepped inside, the house felt different. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like a weight pressing down on us. Every noise seemed amplified, the creak of the floorboards under our feet, the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. But it was more than just the sounds. It was the overwhelming feeling that something unseen was watching us, lurking just beyond the shadows. The young woman moved quickly, her steps sharp with growing panic. She went straight to the phone, and I followed her into the hallway, my eyes scanning the room, half expecting to see the old woman standing there, waiting. She grabbed the phone off the hook and checked the caller ID. Her face drained of color as she turned the display toward me. There it was, the first call I had made. The system showed that someone had answered, right at the time I'd spoken to the elderly woman. There was no denying it. The phone log confirmed what I had feared. Someone had answered that call. It was just another quiet, uneventful night on the job for my brother. He was working his regular shift as a night security guard in an old, slightly run-down office building. The kind of place that had seen better days, with long, dimly lit corridors and heavy doors that creaked when you opened them. His responsibilities were straightforward: monitor the cameras for any movement, and occasionally do a walkthrough to make sure everything was in order. The security system was basic but effective. Motion-sensitive cameras that would light up when they detected movement, marking any activity with a square on the screen. Most nights, it was just routine, the kind of job where nothing much happened, and you were left alone with your thoughts. On this particular night, he took his meal break in one of the more comfortable rooms in the building, a small lounge that had a table with a few chairs, a soft, musty couch, and an old bookshelf that had clearly been there for years. The room had a strange charm to it, like it had been frozen in time. The books on the shelves were a curious assortment, mostly older volumes, some with faded spines that hinted at forgotten stories. My brother had always liked the room. It was quiet, and the old books gave him something to pass the time with when the night dragged on too slowly. As he sat down to eat, he found himself drawn to the bookshelf. One particular book caught his eye, a thick, worn-out hardcover with a faded title that he could barely make out. He pulled it from the shelf, turning it over in his hands. The pages were yellowed, and the cover was cracked in places, but something about it intrigued him. I'll have to remember this one. Looks interesting," he said out loud, more to himself than anyone else, since, after all, he was alone. After a few minutes of flipping through the book, he placed it back on the shelf, finished his meal, and pushed his chair neatly back into place. Everything felt normal, quiet, still, as you'd expect for an empty office building in the dead of night. He turned off the lights, locked the door behind him, and headed back to his desk. It was just another routine part of his shift. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a quiet space, an old book, and the familiar silence of the building as it settled into the night. Or so he thought. As he returned to his desk, ready to keep an eye on the monitors, there was no hint of what was about to happen, no sense of the eerie turn the night was about to take. For a brief moment, everything was still, the calm before the storm. Settling back into his usual routine, my brother returned to the dimly lit security office, the soft hum of the monitors filling the otherwise quiet room. It was the kind of stillness you get used to on night shifts. No footsteps, no chatter, just the flickering screens showing empty hallways and vacant offices. The building felt deserted, almost forgotten in the late hours, and nothing seemed out of place. He sat down, glancing casually at the monitors, expecting another uneventful stretch of time. But then something odd happened. One of the cameras suddenly blinked to life, signaling movement in the room he had just left. His eyes narrowed as the familiar motion detection squares appeared on the screen, tracing some kind of activity. But as he stared at the monitor, trying to make sense of what was going on, he realized something was wrong. There was nothing visible in the room, no person, no object moving, yet the motion detector was clearly registering movement. The squares continued to track something. He leaned in closer to the screen, his pulse quickening. The camera was trained on the very same lounge where he had just eaten his meal, where he had locked the door and turned off the lights. Now, the lights were on again, casting an eerie glow over the room. His chair, the one he had carefully pushed in, appeared untouched, but the motion squares continued to dance across the screen, almost as if they were following an invisible figure. It made no sense. He distinctly remembered locking the door behind him. No one else was in the building. He had checked when he started his shift, and there was only one other way into the building, which was securely locked. So who or what was moving in that room? He felt a chill creep up his spine, a cold realization settling in. This wasn't a malfunction, and it wasn't a trick of the cameras. Something was in that room, moving around, unseen by the camera lens but unmistakable in its presence. Despite the uneasy knot forming in his stomach, he knew he had to check it out. His training and routine took over, even as his instincts screamed at him to stay behind the safety of his desk. Grabbing his flashlight, he made his way back toward the room, each step heavy with dread. The hallway felt longer than usual, the silence now oppressive, broken only by the echo of his footsteps. When he reached the door, his heart raced as he tested the handle. It turned easily in his hand. The door was unlocked. He hesitated, trying to make sense of it. He was sure he had locked it. but as the door swung open, his breath caught in his throat. The lights were on, casting an unnatural brightness across the room. The chair next to the one he had sat in was pulled out, as if someone had been sitting there with him, watching him. But the most unnerving detail was the book. The very same one he had been looking at earlier. The book he had placed back on the shelf. Now it was sitting neatly on the table, open, as if someone had taken it out just for him. The room was empty, but the weight of the unseen presence lingered in the air, thick and undeniable. My brother stood frozen in the doorway, the realization sinking in that he was not alone in this building. Something had been watching him. Perhaps something had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As my brother stood in the doorway, the room felt different, like it had come alive, but not in the way a room should. It wasn't just the lights being on or the chair now conspicuously pulled out. There was something heavier in the air, a sense of being watched, but by something he couldn't see. Every instinct told him that whatever had moved in the room wasn't physical, not in the way we understand, but it was very much there, lurking just beyond the visible. His eyes locked onto the book. It sat in the middle of the table, open, almost expectant. He remembered the way he had pulled it from the shelf, intrigued by its worn cover and faded title, and then carefully replaced it after casually remarking how interesting it looked. He hadn't opened it. He hadn't even read the first page. And yet, there it was, lying flat, as though someone had deliberately placed it back on the table for him to find. The pages fluttered slightly, as if disturbed by a breeze, though the air was still. That small movement sent a cold shiver down his spine. Slowly, almost against his will, he stepped into the room, the door creaking softly behind him as it closed. The sound was far too loud in the silence that enveloped the space. His flashlight beam wavered as his hands trembled slightly, and he aimed it toward the corners of the room, half expecting to catch sight of someone or something hiding just out of view. But the beam illuminated nothing but the stillness of the old office. The walls, the furniture, all were untouched. Yet, the pulled-out chair and the open book told a different story. He circled the table, his eyes never leaving the book, the pages now perfectly still, as though frozen in time. It wasn't just the book that unnerved him. It was the feeling that came with it, the undeniable sense that someone had been in the room with him, and they had been close, too close. His mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. He was the only person in the building, the only person who had access to this room, and yet the evidence in front of him said otherwise. It wasn't the first strange thing that had happened to him while working security, but this was different. The other experiences had been small, fleeting things. Lights flickering in rooms that were supposed to be off, cold drafts in places that shouldn't have any air movement, the occasional creak of floorboards when no one else was around. But this felt personal, as if whatever was there had been paying attention to him, waiting for him to notice it. The book on the table felt like an invitation, or maybe a warning. He stood still for a moment, every nerve in his body on edge. The silence pressed in on him, thick and suffocating, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The rational part of him wanted to walk away, to leave the room and chalk it up to some trick of his mind, some quirk of the old building. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. The movement on the cameras, the unlocked door, the lights being on, all of it pointed to something else, something unseen but undeniably present. With a shaky hand, he reached for the book, almost afraid to touch it. His fingers brushed the old, brittle pages, and for a second, the room felt even colder, as though the very act of interacting with the book had triggered something. He snapped his hand back, leaving the book exactly as it was. The thought crossed his mind that maybe whatever was in the room had wanted him to read it, but the idea was too unsettling to explore further. He turned, stepping away from the table, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of the moment settling deeper with every step he took. As he backed toward the door, the room seemed to close in on him. Every sound, the shuffle of his footsteps, the faint creak of the floor beneath him, was amplified in the quiet until it felt like the building itself was watching him leave. He pulled the door shut behind him with more force than necessary, as if shutting it would somehow keep whatever had happened in that room from following him. He returned to his desk, his heart still racing. The cameras flickered quietly, the screen for the lounge now showing an empty, motionless room. The lights were off again, the door closed, and the motion squares had disappeared. Everything looked exactly as it had before he entered, but he knew better. He had seen the chair, the open book, the lights on where there should have been darkness. The rest of the night passed in an uneasy blur. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that room with him, something unseen and unexplainable. And though he told himself it was just another strange occurrence in an old, creaky building, deep down he knew this one was different. The book, the chair, the feeling of being watched, it stayed with him long after his shift ended, a quiet reminder that some things simply defy explanation. It wasn't the first time something strange had happened during his night shifts, but it was the first time he felt like he had been directly acknowledged by whatever presence lingered in the building. It was as if the building, or something inside it, had responded to him, to his words, to his actions. And that realization was far more terrifying than anything else he had ever experienced on the job. It was one of those nights where everything seemed to fall into place. I was babysitting my niece, trying to get some studying done, and honestly, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. I set up the baby monitor on the table next to my books, the small screen showing my niece sound asleep in her crib. The glow from the monitor was just enough to keep me grounded in the quiet of the house, with nothing but the occasional creak or hum in the background. At some point, the stillness got to me. I guess I didn't realize how tired I was, the way the house was so calm, almost too calm. I must have nodded off for a bit, my head resting on the book, but I jolted awake when I heard something strange. It was faint, like a soft murmur, a whisper that barely registered at first. I thought maybe the baby monitor was picking up some kind of interference, like static, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded deliberate, like someone was whispering directly into the mic. I sat up, squinting at the monitor, trying to make sense of the sound. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In the corner of my niece's room, near the crib, there was a figure. It wasn't a trick of the light or a shadow from something in the room. I know what I saw. It was dark, almost pitch black, and it was just standing there, not moving, like it was watching her. The feeling that hit me in that moment, I can't even describe it. It wasn't just fear. It was like this primal instinct kicked in, telling me that something was very, very wrong. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what I was seeing. Was it a person? Could someone have broken in? But that didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. My niece was still asleep, completely unaware of what was happening around her. I finally snapped out of it and shot up from the table. My body was moving before I could even think straight. All I knew was I needed to get to her, fast. When I burst into the room, everything felt wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and it was colder than it had been before. But the figure, it was gone. There was no sign of anyone, nothing out of place, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in there. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my niece from her crib, clutching her close as I bolted back into the living room. My heart was racing so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I kept looking back at the hallway, half expecting something to follow us out. I sat on the couch, holding her, staring at the baby monitor, trying to make sense of what just happened. The whispering had stopped, but the silence felt even heavier now. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept checking the monitor, half expecting that shadow to come back. When my brother came home later, I wanted to tell him everything, but I was still trying to wrap my head around it. It didn't feel real, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew what I had heard. That shadow, that whisper, something had been in there with my niece, and I had no idea what it was. When my brother finally got home, it was already morning, and I was still wide awake, clutching my niece close to me on the couch. He could see something was off right away, the way I kept glancing nervously at the baby monitor and the hallway leading to her room. I didn't know how to bring it up, didn't know how to even begin explaining what I had seen and heard the night before. How do you tell someone you saw a shadow in their kid's room, something that wasn't supposed to be there? After a few awkward moments of silence, I just blurted it out. I told him about the whispers, about the shadowy figure I'd seen standing near the crib, how it just disappeared when I ran in to check on her. I expected him to laugh it off or tell me I was just imagining things. I mean, I thought maybe I had dreamt the whole thing or that it was a trick of the light. But when I looked at him, I saw his face go pale. His eyes widened, and for a moment he just stood there, processing what I'd said. He didn't laugh. He didn't brush it off. Instead, he asked me something that made my stomach drop. Did it stand in the corner near the crib? I froze. How did he know that? I hadn't told him where the figure was standing, just that I saw something in the room. My mind was racing, but before I could say anything, he sat down and let out this long, shaky breath. He looked like he was debating whether to tell me something or not, but eventually, he broke the silence. He told me he had seen the same thing. Not once, but a couple of times. He described the figure exactly as I had seen it. Dark, almost formless, but unmistakably there, always standing in the same spot, watching. And it wasn't just him who had noticed strange things. His wife had heard whispers coming from the baby monitor a few times too, but they'd always chalked it up to interference or dismissed it as their imagination. They never talked about it because they didn't want to freak each other out. But now, it was undeniable. There was something there. The part that really shook me was when he told me that sometimes, after seeing the figure, they'd find their daughter's crib slightly moved, as if something had nudged it. Not by much, just a few inches, but enough to be noticeable. They had always convinced themselves it was just the floorboards settling or some mundane explanation, but deep down, they both knew something was off. I could see the fear in his eyes as he told me this, but there was something else. Guilt. He asked me not to tell his wife about what I'd seen that night. He said they'd already had enough sleepless nights, and he didn't want her to worry more than she already did. The house was their home, after all. They had put everything into it, and he didn't want to believe there was something evil lurking there. But now that I had experienced it too, there was no denying it. We both knew there was something wrong with that room, something neither of us could explain. He looked exhausted, like this had been weighing on him for years. I could tell he wanted to keep everything normal, keep living in that house, but after hearing his side of the story, I didn't know how they managed to stay there. It was like we had uncovered a dark secret that had been lurking in the shadows all along, something that was always there but never fully acknowledged. The weight of it sat between us, heavy and unsettling, as if we were now both tied to something neither of us understood. After that conversation, there was this unspoken agreement to keep it all hidden, like some kind of pact. We didn't want to cause panic or stir up more fear, but deep down, I knew things would never be the same. What I saw, what he confirmed, it wasn't just a one-time thing. It was real, and it wasn't going away. After that night, things changed, even if we didn't openly talk about it. My brother and his family stayed in that house, but there was this unspoken tension that lingered in the air. Every time I visited, I found myself glancing at the hallway that led to my niece's room, half expecting to see that shadow again, half expecting to hear those whispers through the walls. It was like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But the strangest part came months later. My niece, who by that time had started talking more, began mentioning someone she called her special friend. At first, it seemed innocent. Kids have imaginary friends all the time, right? My brother and his wife brushed it off as typical toddler behavior, but the way she talked about this friend was unsettling. She would describe him in bits and pieces. "He stands in the corner when I sleep," she'd say casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Or she'd tell my brother, "He doesn't talk much, but he watches me." Every time she mentioned her special friend, it sent chills down my spine. It was the corner she always pointed to, the exact same spot where I had seen the shadow that night. My brother's face would go pale whenever she talked about it, but they never let her see their fear. They didn't want to scare her or make her think something was wrong. But deep down, we all knew something wasn't right. It didn't stop there. She would say things like, He says I can play with him when you're asleep, or he's waiting for me when the lights go out. These weren't the typical things a child's imagination conjures up. It was like this special friend wasn't a product of her mind, but something real, something she was interacting with in ways we couldn't understand. I remember one afternoon, I was over for dinner, and she was playing quietly in the living room. My brother's wife was in the kitchen, and my brother and I were sitting on the couch, trying to act like everything was fine. Out of nowhere, my niece turned to me and said, "He doesn't like you." I froze. "Who doesn't like me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, though my heart was racing. "My special friend," she said, matter-of-factly. "He told me when I was sleeping." The room felt colder. My brother didn't say anything, but I could feel his tension beside me. It was like this invisible presence had suddenly entered the room, watching us, making sure we knew it was still there. The days turned into weeks, and the eerie comments from my niece kept coming. Sometimes, she'd mention that her special friend was sad because he couldn't leave the room, or that he liked to hide in the shadows. She even drew pictures of him, nothing too detailed, just vague outlines of a tall, dark figure, usually in the corner of the page. But every time she handed me one of those pictures, it felt like I was holding something much heavier than a child's drawing. One night, my brother called me, his voice tense and quiet. He said they had tried everything: prayers, smudging the house, even rearranging the furniture in my niece's room. But the feeling hadn't gone away. And their daughter kept insisting her special friend was still there, watching her while she slept. There were times she would wake up crying, telling them she didn't want to play with him anymore, that he was scaring her. But other times she'd act like he was just a normal part of her day, like he belonged there. Despite all of this, they stayed in that house for another 4 years. My brother never explained why they didn't leave. Maybe it was because the figure didn't seem to harm anyone physically, or maybe it was just too difficult to accept that something supernatural was happening. Either way, the shadow never fully left. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend for her, just like any other. Her parents and little brother had left earlier in the day, bags packed for a family trip out of town. They had asked her to come along, but her commitment to softball practice kept her behind. At first, she didn't mind. She had the house to herself, no noisy little brother or reminders to clean up after herself. The evening passed uneventfully. She watched some TV, had dinner, and finished her homework, the usual routine. The quiet, though, began to feel heavier as the night deepened. With no one else in the house, the stillness almost felt too perfect, too silent, like the world outside had pressed pause. By the time she got into bed, the house was dark, and the only light came from the soft glow of her phone screen before she turned it off. The moment she closed her eyes, the silence seemed to grow even more intense. But she was used to her room's comforting darkness, and the steady rhythm of her breathing eventually lulled her into sleep. Hours passed, the night creeping on, when suddenly, without warning, her peace was shattered. A loud, violent crash pierced the air. The sound of breaking glass echoed through her room, jolting her awake in an instant. Her heart pounded in her chest as she lay frozen, trying to comprehend what had just happened. For a moment, everything seemed surreal, like she was still caught in the blurry edges of a dream. But the cold draft of air rushing in from the broken window made it painfully real. Her mind raced, trying to process the sound. The window, her bedroom window, had just been shattered. She blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden flood of adrenaline coursing through her. In the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Something was crawling through the jagged opening of her window. At first, she thought maybe an animal had broken in, but as her vision cleared, she realized with a cold rush of dread that it was no animal. It was a person, a shadowy figure pulling itself into her room. Her breath caught in her throat as she lay completely still, paralyzed by fear. Through the darkness, she could just make out the silhouette of a figure, now inside her room. The intruder moved slowly, carefully, like someone who wasn't in a rush, but who knew exactly what they were doing. She could hear the faint crunch of broken glass under their shoes as they stepped cautiously forward, their body tense as if they, too, were unsure of what to expect. For a moment, she hoped the darkness would hide her, that she could remain invisible under the covers. She barely dared to breathe, her chest rising and falling in shallow, quiet gasps. Her heart pounded so loudly that she was sure he could hear it, echoing in the silent room. But the figure was still adjusting to the dim light, their heads swiveling back and forth, scanning the room like a predator searching for prey. The figure stopped, standing eerily still for a second, as if sensing something. Then, slowly, they turned toward her bed. She felt her skin prickle with cold terror as they started inching closer. They hadn't seen her yet, but they were curious. It was as if they noticed the shape under the blankets, the lump in the bed, but weren't sure what it was. Her mind raced as she lay motionless, trying to convince herself to stay calm, stay hidden. Each step the figure took felt like a lifetime. Their movements were unnervingly slow, deliberate, and quiet, like they were trying not to wake anyone, unaware that she was already wide awake, her body stiff with panic. The figure was only a few feet away now, close enough for her to hear their breathing. Their face was still shadowed in the darkness, but she could sense them looming over her. She clenched her eyes shut as they bent down slightly, their head hovering right over her, inches from her face. She could feel the weight of their presence, a suffocating dread pressing down on her. He was so close now that she could make out faint details, the outline of a hood pulled over his head, his breath slow and steady, and his head tilted, as if he were trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The intruder's face was just a few inches from hers, his breath hot on her skin as he tried to get a better look at the lump in the bed. At that moment, all the worst thoughts crossed her mind. Would he attack? What did he want? Should she scream? But her body refused to move, frozen in fear as his eyes began to widen. It was in that breathless, unbearable moment that he finally seemed to realize what the lump was. A person. He paused, his body suddenly tensing as if the realization hit him like a wave. The air in the room felt thick, almost like it was holding its breath along with her. Time seemed to stretch out as the intruder stood frozen, his face just inches from hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. She was too terrified to even blink, and he seemed to be processing the sudden, horrifying realization that the lump in the bed was a person. His eyes, previously searching and unsure, widened in shock, his breath hitching audibly in the darkness. He hadn't expected this. She could feel the heat of his breath on her face, a chilling reminder of just how close he was, how real this was. Her heart hammered violently in her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears, but she didn't dare make a sound. The tension in the room was unbearable, every second stretching into an eternity as the intruder hovered over her, realizing he had been caught, though not in the way he had anticipated. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the intruder began to back away. His movements were deliberate, cautious, as if any sudden noise might provoke a reaction he wasn't prepared for. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but she could feel the shift in his demeanor. He was retreating. The terror didn't lessen, though. In fact, the silence that followed felt even more suffocating, like something unspeakable had been exchanged between them without a single word. His retreat was agonizingly slow. He kept his gaze locked on her, as if unsure whether she was truly awake or still frozen in some kind of sleep paralysis. His body was tense, his every movement deliberate, as if he thought moving too quickly might stir her into action. He seemed just as terrified as she was in that moment, like he was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Her eyes followed him as he cautiously stepped back toward the window, his figure blending into the shadows once more. The sound of glass crunching beneath his shoes sent a jolt through her with each step, the only noise breaking the oppressive silence that filled the room. He turned slightly, glancing toward the window he had shattered just moments before, as if calculating his exit. With a slow, deliberate motion, he crouched down, carefully crawling back through the broken window, the shards of glass glinting faintly in the darkness. His movements were methodical, quiet, like a predator retreating back into the night after realizing the hunt had gone wrong. The cold air from outside rushed into the room, filling the space with a chill that clung to her skin. But she couldn't move. She was still frozen in place, her mind reeling from what had just happened. As the last trace of him disappeared through the window, she finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The room was eerily still again, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. The broken window gaped open, the curtains fluttering slightly in the cool breeze. She lay there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to even turn on the light. What if he was still outside, watching? What if this wasn't over? Her body trembled uncontrollably, but she forced herself to stay still, listening for any sign that he might return. Minutes passed, though it felt like an eternity, before she finally gathered the courage to sit up. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, but she didn't dare make a call, not yet. She needed to be sure he was really gone. Slowly, she tiptoed to the window, peeking out into the inky darkness beyond. There was nothing, no sign of him, only the quiet street and the stillness of the night. The realization that she had been mere inches from a stranger, face to face with an intruder in her own room, made her skin crawl. Even though he was gone, the feeling of his presence lingered like a shadow that refused to lift. The memory of his eyes widening in fear as he realized she was awake played over and over in her mind. He hadn't harmed her, hadn't spoken, but the encounter left a scar deeper than any physical wound. For the rest of the night, she sat in her bed, lights on, her back against the wall, waiting for morning to come, praying that she would never see those eyes again.